So I really appreciate Colin going through and taking care of my first slide for me. Yeah, my name's Ben, and I am new to the Tufts community, and it's really been great to get to know some of you over these last couple of months. And I'm looking forward to, if I haven't met you, getting to know you a little better as time goes on. So I think I've been to now several of these talks, and I've really been enjoying the diversity of topics, the diversity of perspectives. I think this is a great opportunity for students and for the community to kind of get a feel for what environmental studies is all about and what you can do with an environmental studies background. So I might just take a minute and just talk a little bit more about kind of how I came around to doing this kind of work and how it's sort of shaped my perspectives. So as Colin said, I did my undergraduate at the University of Hawaii, and I went to the University of Auckland in New Zealand for my graduate studies. My background is in anthropology, but more specifically archaeology. So I'm interested in the study of human cultures in the past. And while I was doing this, I got really into building computer simulations as a way of exploring historical processes, learning about how patterns kind of form in societies, in environments, through the interactions of individuals and groups, right? So that's one of the main reasons that I am here doing this work. But I can really thank, let's see now, I've got, there we go. Sure, I might be in, there we go. Okay, cool. So I really have some researchers who are working in Australia to thank for why I'm kind of doing what I'm doing now. In Australian archaeology, there's been this long-standing notion of what's called the fire stick farming hypothesis. And the fire stick farming hypothesis is the idea that, and this was developed initially in the 1970s, initially kind of developed by an archaeologist named Rhys Jones. And Rhys Jones's idea was that fire played a major role in shaping the landscapes of Australia over time. But the firing that happens, there's a lot of natural fire that occurs in the Australian environment, but the environments as they stand today are largely the product of anthropogenic burning. So burning that's coming from humans interacting with their environment. And so Rhys Jones kind of developed this idea that by burning the land, there was actually creating opportunities within the landscape for kind of recruitment of new species, influencing the biodiversity of the landscape, changing the availability of resources within that landscape, and then that feeds back into human behavior. Right? And so this is kind of a classic instance of a coupled natural human system. Right? And so more recently, researchers of Penn and the University of Utah have been working on questions related to why does that work, right? How does that work? What are the mechanisms? And looking at how it works from kind of an evolutionary ecological perspective. And so what they found is that these behaviors, when people are setting fire to the landscape, oftentimes they're doing so with sort of local intent, right? Trying to develop affect a condition that is affecting them in kind of in the local sense, right? But over time, as these individual instances of this burning behavior plays out, it starts to have large-scale ramifications, emergent properties in terms of what the landscape ends up looking like. So, as I said, my when I'm trying to think about these types of things, my initial go-to is to try and build a simple model, right? To try and understand things using a simple model. I'm going to try something dangerous here, which I know you're never supposed to do when you're doing a presentation like this, which is to try and switch to a different screen. But I'm going to give that a shot. Oh no. Oh no. All right. Let me try this one more time. Okay. Well, any idea how I get over to the, it's just, what was there? Sure, sure. Ah, there it is. Oh, right, I'm up on this screen. I can't see it here. Okay, very good. Okay, so in this simulation, what we've got here is we've got some, we're going to set this up. So this is called an agent-based model, right? And the way an agent-based model works is you've got individual entities that are going to perform some particular activity, and that can be a process that's where their behaviors are adaptive. So they'll make decisions about what they do in their environment and in relation to each other based on what their current state is. So in this simulation, we've got a number of people who are distributed across a landscape. While they're in that landscape, they're going to be trying to procure resources from it. They're going to be trying to find ways to subsist within this landscape. So what they'll do is they'll start to move around the landscape. And as they do so, they'll interact with the resources, they'll consume the resources. And then there is a small probability that they will, when they do so, they'll engage in some sort of behavior that will disturb that environment, right? Something like burning, right? In this model, it's a completely random decision, right? There's an equally good probability, in fact, a better than equally good probability they won't do this, right? It's just a very small probability. But in fact, the likelihood that they do so is something that is based on what their ancestors did. So as they go, they will reproduce and they'll pass on this, like the likelihood that they will engage in this burning behavior. But again, it's a very small probability. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this to go. We've got a bunch of different variables here related to how burning behavior will modify the vegetation in terms of making it have more value or less value, and we'll have values about how many moves they make to procure resources, which will be determined in part by their ability to meet their needs. But in this model, there's no direction. They're not trying to do anything. This is just, they're engaging with their environment. There's no directed behavior. I'm going to just set this to go. It goes pretty quick, but I'm going to slow it down here so you can kind of see. I'm tracking a whole bunch of values here, like the population, the age structure, how prevalent the burning behavior is in this environment. Right now, it's very small. The average forage that's available per capita. But I hope what you've already noticed here is that the dark colors of these grid cells here is indicating how much resource there is available in the environment, right? So the color of the grid cell, darker equals more resource, right? And I can set this up again and start it from the beginning. But what you can see is that over time, the burning's increasing. Now, there's nothing directing that process. Nothing is telling these individuals, well, you're getting something out of this, so you should burn more, right? They're not targeting any of these grid cells that have the most resources. They're moving around randomly. And in fact, we've even got a value here at the bottom right that's keeping track of how often individuals are gaining a benefit from their own burning behavior, right? But what this is showing is that even in the absence of directed behavior, right? Even in the absence of some force that's directing these individuals to try and obtain more resource, the population is still growing. In fact, it's growing substantially. And it's modifying this landscape so that it's completely different from the landscape that exists without this intervention. So what this suggests, from my perspective, is that you can have these large-scale changes to both social entities and environmental entities through these interactions that are mostly occurring at a very small local scale, right? But played out over the long term. Right? So that's, to me, the main takeaway from this exercise is to show how, all right, now I want to switch back to Zoom, switch back to PowerPoint. Is to show how, oh, okay, here we go. Escape. Right. Right. So the idea is to show that, but of course that's all happening in the absence. There's lots of other things that are interesting about how these dynamics work that have a lot to do with things like decision-making, things like knowledge, right? Things like the heterogeneity of these environments. The environment that I just created is completely homogeneous. There's no difference from one cell to the next other than what people are doing to it. Right? But there is natural heterogeneity in environments that will affect these processes, right? So I have this work on Australian burning to thank for how I'm understanding these types of behaviors. Now, burning is not the only way that people can intervene in an environment, right? There are also a number of other ways that people might modify their environments in such a way that will influence down the road whether or not it takes on a different state, takes on a different character, and whether that'll have an influence subsequently on how humans use it. One of these ways is through animal husbandry. And so this gets me into talking about mobile pastoralism. So mobile pastoralism, first of all, pastoralism, when we talk about pastoralism, we're talking about livestock keeping, and livestock keeping takes on a wide variety of forms, exists across the spectrum. Right? So we've got ranchers operating, rotating stock, all the way through to people who are moving livestock around, and that's the end of the spectrum that I'm most interested in, is this mobile pastoralism. Right, so this is where it's a subsistence strategy where you're moving livestock around according to the seasonal availability of pasture and other resources. So this approach first of all, the domestication of animal species and the beginnings of pastoralism go way back to about 10,000 years ago, give or take, originating in Southwest Asia. But most of the pastoralism that's taking place there is mostly local scale. So you've got individuals who are keeping animals, but the movements that they're undertaking are mostly local. They're not really moving away from major settlement areas. Pastoralism spreads both into east across Asia, west into Europe, but it also spreads south into Africa. And about 5,000 years ago, it reaches sub-Saharan Africa. And the area that it arrives in is in and around the Rift Valley in Africa, in places like Ethiopia and Kenya. And it's arriving in places that are extraordinarily dry, right? Particularly at that time when it arrives, things are quite dry. And so one of those places is East Turkana. And East Turkana is in far northern Kenya, just south of the Ethiopian border, on the eastern shore of the endorheic Lake Turkana. Okay, so Lake Turkana is home to the site of Koobi Fora. Now, has anybody heard of Koobi Fora from outside of here? I know I'm taking a risk in asking a nerdy archaeological question. No? That's cool. Have a look it up sometime. Koobi Fora is home to some of the earliest fossils in human evolution. So we're looking at Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, about 1.8, 1.9 million years ago, and then other hominid ancestors going back even further than that. The reason why they occur here is because of the geological history of Lake Turkana, which is again part of the Great Rift system. So tectonics have lifted sediment profiles that go back to these periods of time up towards the surface so that we can see them. And so we find these fossils on the surface. But it also preserves time periods throughout human history. So from that 1.8, 1.9 million years ago, or maybe even earlier, all the way up to the present, right? And so we find archaeology from when we start changing stone tools and adding new technological features to our processes. When we start modifying how we settle, and eventually the incorporation of livestock, right, and the development of pastorals and the introduction of pastoralism into East Africa. So Koobi Fora is well known for its archaeological history. It's also a place that is home to a number of pastoralist communities. So in particular, the Turkana, the Gabra, and the communities in and around this settlement called Ilaret, were the Daasanach. So Daasanach the Daasanach pastoralists are a group that's a Nilotic speaking group that exists between southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. In Ethiopia, their subsistence practices are probably better described as agropastoralism. It's a better watered environment and they're able to grow food. But south of the Ethiopian border, conditions are a lot drier. We have a bimodal rainfall distribution in this part of Africa. So 2 rainy seasons a year, one usually in April, the other closer to kind of the August, September period. And they're referred to as the long and short rains. And so the long rains, you get more rain, short rains, you get less rain. This graph here on the right is showing kind of the trends in the seasonal rainfall. But this is for the entirety of the Rift Valley. So this part of Kenya probably sits at the lower end of this distribution. Daasanach pastoralists live in this area today, but pastoralists have lived in this area for over 5,000 years. Different pastoralist groups have lived in this area for over 5,000 years and developed adaptations that include mobile pastoralism. So what does that look like in practice? So under prevailing normal circumstances, the general trend is to move during the wet seasons, move out into what's called the Fora. And the Fora is basically the hilly land up from Lake Turkana. In these areas, you find a quite diverse landscape in terms of its vegetation communities. And when I say diverse, I mean there's a lot of variability in the quality of them, but some of them are quite high quality. And so people will move up and take advantage of these high quality resources that emerge following rainfall, right? As conditions start to dry, some of these resources start to diminish. People will start to migrate back down towards the lake edge, which is a much more stable resource base. The forage there isn't as high quality, but it's usually available most of the year. So this is a kind of, the process, the adaptation here is to take advantage of resources that are heterogeneous both in time and space. Now, perspectives on pastoralism have changed substantially over the last several decades. So this is an environmental studies crowd. I've got to assume that the tragedy of the commons is something that's still being taught. Everybody's got some familiarity with this idea. So Hardin's original paper, of course, uses pastoralism as kind of the primary analogy for the tragedy of the commons. And pastoralism gets in a kind of through the mid to late 20th century, gets a lot of blame for problems related to erosion caused by overgrazing and overstocking pastures under conditions of, in particular in East Africa, where you've got the compounding effects of drought creating problems related to overgrazing. More recently, though, perspectives are starting to be modified, and this is in part due to taking a longer-term view of pastoralism's role in shaping these environments. So a number of studies have been conducted that have looked at how pastoralism is affecting different environments over time. So studies have looked at how pastoralism, for example, the use of browsing species like goats within a environment can help to avoid woody encroachment in these types of environments. You might also look at questions related to the formation of grassy environments. So a number of studies have looked at this phenomenon that's known as the hotspot phenomenon, the glade phenomenon, where the keeping of livestock within a pasture will both reduce this woody encroachment, but it will also, through manuring and through the addition of preferential species, will create these open grassy areas that are both useful for livestock, but also for wildlife as well. So pastoralism, in this sense, is operating as an ecosystem engineer. It's modifying the landscape, and it's creating new opportunities, and again, drawing on longer-term perspectives. So this process has been viewed both in longitudinal studies in the contemporary sense, but also through the lens of archaeology. So some recent studies in East Africa looking at pastoral settlements going back as long as 3,000 years have found that elevated nutrient levels inside of these settlements, suggesting that there is an influence that's happening that is persisting through time. Right. But there's still a lot of things that are not well understood about this process. And I'm thinking back now to the model that I was, the model that I showed you at the beginning. A lot of this is understood at a very kind of local scale, right? We're understanding sort of what's happening, say, in an exclosure, to try and understand the differences between these effects locally. Whereas what we know about pastoralism is that it's a process. Mobile pastoralism is taking place over large areas, and people are moving to exploit these very highly distributed and highly heterogeneous environments. We also have a very poor understanding of how this interfaces with knowledge among pastoralist communities. So we're still sort of looking at this through the lens of somebody comes in, modifies, and then goes away, rather than somebody who has knowledge of the ecology of these plants, of the ecology of these environments, and may modify their behavior and adjust their behavior accordingly. So this has led to, I've been lucky to be part of a NSF-funded research project looking at trying to answer this question about how the long-term consequences of land use in ecosystems where pastoralists live, what the consequences are of those patterns. Right? What are we trying to, what's happening to these landscapes as a result of these local scale interactions over long periods of time, right? So we're trying to take, so the kind of key words in this, here are long-term and land use, right? Long-term, we're trying to understand not just what's happening in the course of the study, but how this is played out over very long periods of time. We're also trying to understand how, one second. trying to understand how this is playing out over large areas rather than just in a single study site. Building a bigger picture, a more comprehensive picture of the effects as they're played out at that emergent scale. This is a project that involves quite a few collaborators, not least the Daasanach community, who we work with to try and build our understanding of pastoralist knowledge and of the Koobi Fora ecosystem. And in particular, I want to acknowledge the assistance of Chief Michael Maroto. We also have a number of graduate students who are working with us, who are out there talking to people who are taking way too many measurements of grass. It's the only way that this sort of project is achievable is through interdisciplinary and participatory research. So when I talked to these collaborators, when I talked to these folks about giving this presentation, they said, oh, great, just make sure you use some really good pictures of us doing the field work. And I ran into a problem. Turns out I am terrible at taking fieldwork photos. So when I go back and I look through my camera, I find that the vast majority of these photos are pictures of field recording sheets, the ground, and best of all, hundreds and hundreds of images of animal rear ends. So I apologize in advance for my lack of awareness here. My attention is principally on trying to make sure we're getting the work done so that we're able to achieve our objectives for the community and to deliver on this project. It means that I don't spend a lot of time taking pictures. Luckily, some of those wonderful collaborators have taken a few pictures, so anything you see from here on out is their work, not mine. One of the areas that we have focused our attention on is on this question related to the hotspot phenomenon and the use of corralling and how that influences the development and persistence of grassy habitats within the Koobi Fora area. So what you're looking at here is called a boma. A boma is a cattle enclosure. This one here is a boma that includes a settlement. So you've got a number of manyata or houses in the back here. Usually around 40 to 50 people might be living at a settlement like this, as well as 200 or so head of livestock, goats, cattle, fat-tailed sheep, camels, and donkeys. So what you can see here is typical of what you'd see when you're kind of hanging around the boma in the evening, right? So most of these animals have been out to pasture during the course of the day, have been foraging in different parts of the landscape, and now have been brought back and are put inside a protective enclosure made out of thorn bushes for the night, and they'll spend that time there. And while they're there, they're milling about, hooves are turning up the ground, the animals are defecating, that's adding nutrients to the soil, it's also adding particular seeds from particular species that these animals consume. So this is the active boma. This is what's happening at that local level. This is what's happening at that individual scale, these individual interactions. Now, after maybe a month and a half, people will move on and they'll, jumped ahead. And they'll leave behind aspects of these structures. The ground will, for the most part, be cleared and bare. There will be a few objects which the archaeologists among us will be interested in just from a perspective of trying to understand the types of things people leave behind. But what we're seeing here is sort of, this is the end result, right? This is what ends up being left behind after the boma is abandoned. So in the immediate aftermath, we've got the structure like this, but come back a year or 2 years later, and this is what it looks like. So the ground has been cleared, right? So we've now got the woody vegetation has been kind of kept at bay here. And what we see is a proliferation of herbaceous vegetation and grass in particular in these environments. So this is effectively what people have referred to as the hotspot, right? This is the glades that are being generated through this process. And so we want to ask questions about that process. We want to know, how different is this from the local environment? What sorts of things, what kind of services is this going to provide for a pastoralist community? So some of the initial research we've done has been looking at abandoned boma sites around Koobi Fora in some of the different environments. So we've got sites that are closer to Ilaret, which is the main settlement, but we've also got sites that are sort of in the more coastal zone, and we've got sites that are spread out into the Fora. We've also got sites that are both inside and outside of the boundary of Sigaloi National Park. These are areas where grazing has been historically part of the regime, but is currently a matter of conflict between herding populations in northern Kenya and the government. But so we've gone out and looked at, I think, about 15 or 16 of these bomas over a period of seasons to try and get a sense of how they're changing in response to changes in precipitation over time, and the time periods over which they've been abandoned. So trying to look at the effects of time. The initial study, the initial couple of pilot studies that we did species censuses inside of bomas, and then at a location 100 meters outside of a boma to try and get a comparative sample between these two. And what we find is pretty unsurprisingly, so if looking at what you're looking at here on the top here, the orange lines are the 2021 season and 2019 is in green. We get a pretty strong distinction here between these two in terms of the percentage of herbaceous plants, both inside the bomas and outside the bomas. But what I'm hoping you'll notice is that on the transect side, so that's outside the bomas, we get a pretty strong distinction between the two seasons. And that has to do with the availability of rainfall that's occurring when these transects were being measured. So in the 2019 season, 2019 was a reasonably, a pretty dry season, whereas 2021 was a wetter season. But inside of the bomas, the percentage of herbaceous cover is not really changing all that dramatically across that rainfall gradient. So this is suggesting that the bomas are hanging on to grasses for longer periods and other herbaceous plants over periods of time. And we've also got at the bottom here, looking at the ages of the bomas, so the months since they've been abandoned. So upwards of, I think we've got 5 years on some of these bomas from this study. We can see that there's shifts in the variability in the amount of vegetation, but generally speaking, the average is pretty consistent across time. So this suggests that people are creating these fairly persistent glades that are full of plants that are of value to livestock. More recently, we've been looking at this in terms of cover. So we've been conducting surveys looking at the percentage of bare cover versus vegetated cover. And what we can find between 2022, which was a fairly dry year, and 2023, which was taken right after rainfalls. In fact, at the tail end of the rainy season in 2023, was that the amount of bare cover inside the bomas decreases dramatically when you're immediately after the rain. So this is creating a green up effect that's occurring, and this is where these are the sorts of things that when people are moving out into the fora away from the lake margin, this is the sort of thing that they're going to be looking for. The composition of these varies. In the 2013 season, which you see here at the bottom, you can see kind of the mean percentage of different covers. So at this point in the year, grasses were more abundant inside the bomas, but other species that come up faster, like amaranthus, were in higher abundance at that time. So we're seeing now what the effects are at that local level, what the effect of the disturbances over that period of time. How much of a difference does this make? How much of a difference could this make? All right, we need to get at the bigger scale, and we need to get at time to try and figure that out. One of the ways we're doing that is by looking at historical aerial imagery. And so what you can see here, this is a lot of the Koobi Fora area represented in this image on the left. On the right is a zoomed in area that you can see in the box here. And you can see in these aerial images, we can actually see where bomas are in here. And these dots here that you're seeing are all of the locations where we are, through a process of multiple people looking at these images and plotting where the bomas are, we're most confident that these are. So there's about 300 bomas visible in this image from 1965. Most of what we found from looking at contemporary satellite imagery that actually has higher resolution is that bomas tend to be visible usually within the first 2 to 3 years after they're constructed. And after that, their visibility decreases dramatically in your ability to see them in satellite imagery. So most of what we're seeing here in this image was constructed probably within the last 2 or 3 years. Right? So if you sum all of that up, you're looking at an addition in about a period of 2 to 3 years of about 700 acres of land that's being able to be used over time. Now, the other big thing that we're learning from this process is that we're learning that the impacts of knowledge are far more nuanced than existing models are accounting for. So here we're conducting focus groups with pastoralist groups in Koobi Fora. This one's at a settlement called Gworo. And we're asking folks about how they identify the quality, how they identify and characterize the quality of pasture. So these are being done as semi-structured focus groups, but for those of us who are in ENB 120, we're also doing some survey work while we're here, including ranking different species. So this is translating, the skills that we're working on here have been honed through fieldwork. But we're getting a more complex picture out of these interviews. We're starting to understand how this affects the temporality of the process, what sorts of things might influence mobility among these among folks as they're moving out into the fora and back. So we learned things like what species are going to draw an animal in and make them hang around a little bit longer versus which ones kind of do they pass by and move on. When those come up, so do they come up following the wet season? Do they persist into the dry season? What is their nutritional value? So some of these species, one of these species, for example, when we've been doing the rankings, we were finding in some pretty high abundance in a couple of bomas, and we asked about it. I said, "Oh no, that one's no good." And then got a very detailed example of the influence of this plant on animal health, which was informative. We also get a sense, as I said, about the temporality, right? So we can think about what's happening to these bomas in the year immediately after. There may be grasses that come up following the abandonment of some of these bomas, but the in the immediate aftermath, the condition of the soils the conditions of the plants may not be such that people will actually want to use them. So there may be a kind of a waiting period, and that's going to work into the model and make the availability of resources fluctuate over time. Okay. So we're getting a better picture from this research of how people are using the landscape and how the changes that are being brought in the landscape are going to be feeding back into that system. The overall objective, of course, is to try and make this information useful and make it available so that people can start drawing on it for adapting to some of the challenges that are coming, and in particular, the challenge of climate change. So there's kind of two big things that are kind of affecting communities in this area as a result of climate change. The first is drought. So this climate change, the local effects of climate change are more droughts and more intense droughts. And so between 2021 and 2022, there were 2 periods of failed rainfall that resulted in a massive die-off of cattle and large-scale problems for food availability in the region. But groups in East Africa have been adapting to this problem for quite some time. So one study recently looked at how diversification of livestock species is helping to ameliorate some of these issues. So adding more grazers, browsers in and decreasing the number of grazers in a herd can help to make it more climate resilient. The other issue is Lake Turkana itself. So Lake Turkana and the lake margin is a critical pasture environment, particularly for dry seasons. In the early 2000s, Ethiopia was working on, has now pretty much completed the construction of a hydroelectric dam on the Omo River. This, combined with climate change, was expected to have a serious drying effect on the lake, right? It was going to dry up the environment. And people were concerned for a long time that this was going to be catastrophic for this community. The effect has actually been the opposite. So these are lake levels from Lake Turkana since the mid-90s, I think. And what we've seen is the lake levels actually have increased. This is a twofold issue. Part of this is a geological explanation related to the formation of the lake bed. The other is that you're seeing increased rainfall in a number of the stream catchments that feed Lake Turkana. And so this is making more water available. However, it's also leading to an extension of the lake shore, which is inundating a number of these pasture areas that people are using on a regular basis. This is creating problems during the dry season because you now have decreased availability of this very critical resource that exists on the lake shore. So we can start to try and address some of these issues in our modeling efforts by trying to understand how patterns of movement in the past have helped people to address issues related to aridity and issues related to the fluctuations of the lake shore. So by taking that long-term perspective and by looking at how the local scale processes are expanding up into across landscapes and through time, we can start to try and build better plans for the future as far as the management of these resources and help communities to integrate historical perspectives to intervene in the charting of direction of the Anthropocene. Okay, that's all I got. I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. Happy to bring the mic around for questions if anybody has any.
Uh, how happy do the people and animals seem?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. So I think I can't speak directly for the Daasanach, right? It's not my place. My understanding is that the Daasanach have problems that are specific to their situation, right? So they have conflicts with other groups. They have conflicts with the Kenyan government. There are issues related to the increasing sedentization. So people abandoning the mobile pastoralist lifeways and moving into settlements is creating problems locally. So there are certainly problems within the community. How that affects happiness is something I can't really elaborate on. As far as the relationship with animals goes, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think when we think about farming, and in particular the meat industry in this country, right, we tend to think of it as pretty brutal. The relationship that exists between pastoralists and herd animals is, I think, a lot more nuanced, right? I think there's a lot more room for one of the things I was reading just the other day that I think described this really nicely is that when pastoralists move with animals in the landscape, if you think about, say, ranching in the United States, we move animals around, right, to try and rotate them around to pastures. The relationship with mobile pastoralists is that the animals actually have a lot of agency, and the pastoralists are, in many cases, being led by the animals to where the forage is. Does that help? Cool.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. So I was very interested to see your use of agent-based modeling to simulate in your context. So there's one of the things that's said about agent-based models is sort of how certain variables and sort of what kind of assumptions you make about those variables and how they behave can have an impact on sort of the insights that we derive. In your modeling context, can you give an example of such a variable or variables where the assumptions about what they might be or how they might behave materially change the kind of conclusions that you draw?
Sure, absolutely. I think whenever I talk about models and I talk about what their value is, I think I always go back to the George Box quote, which is that all models are wrong, right? Every model is wrong, but some models are useful. So when I'm building a model, one of the ways that I try and make sure that I'm addressing that very issue, right, is to try and build a model start by building a model that's as simple as possible, right? Start by building a model where I know that all of the variables that are going into this are going to be simplified, they're going to be abstracted, they're not going to necessarily deal with a lot of the nuance, the heterogeneity. They're going to just try and understand the interactions of a couple of variables. And one of the things that's amazing is that even with just like 2 or 3 variables, you could get incredibly complex behavior, right? So in some of the work I've done in archaeology, we've been able to show that, we do a lot of this sort of null modeling, right? Or like I was showing you earlier, where I'm not assuming that there's any sort of direction in terms of the behavior, but even with that, we can get a directed process. And so in some of the modeling I've done in archaeology, I've been able to show that even through random processes of erosion and deposition, we can end up with patterns that look like the things that archaeologists describe as being evidence of population growth, of increased social complexity. When I'm trying to build a model that's going to try and address something that's got a more specific case, I start from those simple blocks and then I add in and I see what the effect is, test it out, run it under all configurations. It's a painstaking process. And I think a lot of folks who work in the agent-based modeling realm will oftentimes start off, particularly as students, and I was certainly guilty of this myself when I started, of building models that try and replicate the world, right? They try and build a model that's going to replicate the world. And when you do that, you really open up that opportunity to conclude a variable that you don't quite understand its effect. Does that help?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. Really interesting. I'm from the nutrition school. My name is Alexandra Thorne, and I've done a little bit of work on like meat production potential around here, so Northeast.
Sure.
One of the things that, you know, it's just kind of like prevalent in the conversations right now around climate is like the role of livestock in the carbon balances and methane and so on. And then there's kind of this counter current of trying to like build this story of like, if you have just the right rotational system, you might actually be able to store more carbon. And, you know, I heard you mention, you know, the livestock is preventing woody encroachment, and yet the kind of my biologist wheels are turning like, okay, but those woody plants are doing a lot more carbon sequestration. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those issues.
I think we're talking about questions related. I think if you know, we want to relate this to what's happening with climate change, I think we're talking about issues of scale, right? So if we wanted to try and project, you know, the thing about the pastoralism that's happening here in this part of East Africa is it's an adaptation, and it's something that's evolved over a long period of time in within that environment. What I try and do when I try and think about this, I try and think about you know, okay, what would be the alternative, right? I try and imagine trying to do some sort of farming at Koobi Fora, what kinds of infrastructure that would require, what kinds of inputs that would require, what kinds of petrochemicals that's going to require, right? In order to feed the folks who are living here. Pastoralism manages to do this in a way that is comparably efficient, right? In a way that makes sense for this environment. At the larger scale, in situations where it's more feasible to grow food, and then I could see the intervention making sense. I have a hard time seeing it making sense here. For the woody encroachment component, again, I feel like, you know, talking about the removal of shrubs from this environment to facilitate a symbiotic relationship that exists between the livestock animals and the pastures. It's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off, and in this case, if we were to switch and allow woody encroachment to happen all the way up to the lake edge here, then there's going to be a reckoning on so many other levels, right? So you're going to have to house people on the lake edge. You're going to have to feed people on the lake edge, and you're going to have to protect people from an increasingly hostile climate. I'm not sure. I'd be willing to entertain some alternative arrangements in this circumstance, and I'd certainly be willing to model them.
Well, I think we're at time. I have so many questions and I can't wait to chat about them. If you have more questions, feel free to come up and chat with Ben briefly after. I will just mention that next week's talk is Smart Reforestation, Advancing Tropical Forest Restoration via Sustainable Future, sort of kind of building on this theme of what does a sustainable future look like. Thank you, Ben, so much. Big round of applause, please.